Welcome, everybody. I'm Helena Cobban. I'm the president of Just World Educational, and I'm desperately trying to actually bring up my script, which I can't find, but okay. This is really embarrassing, but anyway, this is the 6th of our 8 webinars in the series on Ukraine crisis, building a just and peaceful world. My co-host is Richard Falk, and our excellent project manager, Amel Zaroug, is in the background. We're lucky today, on Monday, March 21st, to have with us 2 guests with extremely deep knowledge and understanding of Russian-Ukrainian and Russian-American relations, both of whom have been doing some very constructive writing and speaking on Ukraine-related issues over the past few weeks. They are Ray McGovern, a fluent Russian speaker who for 27 years was a CIA analyst on Russia. Ray has spent more recent decades as an activist against the excesses of the US intelligence agencies and the warmongering of the US corporate media. In early 2003, he was a founder of the group Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which exposed how the George W. Bush administration was falsifying intelligence in a bid to justify war on Iraq. He has long led a Speaking Truth to Power ministry for the Ecumenical Church of the Savior here in Innocent City, Washington. Great to have you here, Ray.
Thank you, Helena.
And we have Anatol Lieven, who is a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From 1985 through 1998, Anatol worked as a journalist in the former Soviet Union, East Europe, and South Asia, covering the wars in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Southern Caucasus. He has authored numerous books on Russia and its neighbors, including Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry, which came out in 1999. His latest book, Climate Change in the Nation State, was published in March 2020. And actually, it has great relevance to the topic we'll be talking about today. Good to see you, Anatol.
Thank you for inviting me.
My co-host here is Richard Falk, who I hope needs no introduction. We are both much looking forward to going deep with you both into the core issue of how this terrible conflict can be ended on a constructive and sustainable basis. So now let me hand over to you, Richard. Richard, unmute.
I just want to echo what you have said by way of introduction. It's a pleasure to have as our guests 2 of the most influential, articulate, and trustworthy commentators on the issues raised by the Ukraine crisis. We're at I think at a critical point where it's very confusing as to what the 2 leaders of the US and Russia really are giving priority to, and whether a viable peace can be established before the economic, ecological, and political adverse repercussions engulf the engulf the whole spectrum of global policy issues. So we meet at a critical time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Today's webinar is the 6th of a planned 8 sessions, our earlier sessions, involving an array of very well qualified and thought-provoking guests, were all excellent. You can access the videos, audios, and transcripts of those sessions, and a lot more information about this project at our website, www.justworldeducational.org. The video of today's session will be uploaded there soon. Today's conversation will be fairly free-flowing and is projected to last roughly 45 minutes. After that, there'll be a chance for questions from the attendees, which we ask you to put into the Q&A box. Also, my colleague Amel Zaroug is behind the scenes here, and if you have technical questions, please put them and address them to Amel Zaroug in the chat box. Finally, in these emotionally taxing times, we ask everyone for civility from all attendees, both in the chat box and also if you're invited on air there too. So first, I'll come to you, Anatol Lieven. You have done some really fascinating writing over the past few weeks, and last Friday you had an article titled, "Ukraine has already won." I wonder if you could outline the shape of the piece you envisaged in that article and assess whether views such as yours are actually, whether they have traction or they're gaining traction here in Washington, DC.
Thank you so much. Well, my argument in that article was that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was clearly predicated on the belief that Ukraine is not really a nation, that the Ukrainian defense would collapse easily, and that Russia would be able to take over large parts of Ukraine with very little fighting. In particular, it was based on the belief that Russian and Russian-speaking people in eastern and southern Ukraine would basically welcome the Russian invasion. Now, all of those premises have been proved to be false. And in many ways, I think what this war has demonstrated is something that was not necessarily believed before, even perhaps by many Ukrainians and others in the world, and not just in Russia. But I mean, it really has proved that Ukraine is an independent nation. And I think in the process, it has completely defeated any Russian hope of subjugating the whole of Ukraine and turning Ukraine into a client state. I don't think that that is in any way a viable Russian agenda anymore. And it seems to me that actually the Russian government has also abandoned that because of the strength and unity of the Ukrainian resistance. And therefore that Russia's aims are now more limited, one. And secondly, that even if we have a treaty of neutrality, which, by the way, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has now said is possible, if only because NATO clearly won't fight to defend Ukraine. So, you know, the idea of NATO membership is absurd. But I think what has been demonstrated is that a treaty of neutrality would not prevent Ukraine from moving towards the West, you know, and developing as a democracy and a successful economy, because of what the Ukrainians have proved about themselves, you know, in this war. Now, of course, one can't rely on that, whether this unity would last after the war, whether Ukraine would be capable of the necessary reforms. But I think the point is that, you know, most of Ukraine, barring obviously Crimea and the disputed area of the Donbass, is now in fact, once the war is over, safe as an independent country and can seek a compromise peace on that basis.
Right. Well, I'll come back to you maybe a little bit later about whether the shape of the piece you envisaged in that article, and to assess whether views such as yours are gaining traction in Washington. I'll come back to you on that later. But first, I wanted to ask Ray McGovern to give your assessment of whether Washington is likely to opt for a speedy diplomatic outcome, or whether the hawks who want a long, grinding war seem to be in charge in Washington, and maybe what people in the peace movement can do about this.
In a word, Helena, the hawks are clearly in charge. They are challenging Biden himself to be more assertive and to be more risky in terms of risking more with nuclear-equipped Russia. I probably should, well, I would ascribe to your appeal for civility. I need to appeal for some understanding of my humility. I've been dead wrong. It doesn't matter if you focus on the Soviet Union and Russia for half a century. It turns out when you say Putin would never be stupid enough to invade Ukraine, You can be wrong, and I was. And so I want to start out on that humble note. I remember hearing once that if you start out showing your humility, well, then you got it made. You can fake that, you can fake anything. Okay, so what's the story here? I was wrong. I wasn't alone, but misery loves company. It doesn't do much for me. What happened? Well, no one seems to acknowledge this, and maybe it comes from my early decades watching Sino-Soviet relations and thinking at the time that these two countries would hate each other forever. Whoa, wrong about that too. More enlightened leadership came in, and before you know it, we have what both countries describe as a strategic relationship that exceeds a traditional treaty. There is no limit to the cooperation, according to both presidents. What does that mean? Well, I thought, it's really neat rhetoric. When push comes to shove, they're going to follow their own strategic interests, and they're not going to get involved in NATO on one part or out there in the South China Sea. I was wrong. The Chinese have decided to become involved in the NATO question. And I think it's partly because a year ago, NATO decided to get involved in the Chinese question. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was going to go against China. That's what they said. That's what, what's his name, Jens Stoltenberg said. So what we have here is a situation where it's unique in my experience, and that is that we have these two countries, China and Russia, and they're so close that it's hard for me to believe. Now, how did this come about? Well, almost exactly a year ago, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan met with the Chinese in Anchorage and adopted the attitude of the old British imperialists. They talked down to them, and the Chinese said, you're not qualified to talk down to us. We've had enough of that British type stuff, enough of that Japanese type stuff. Don't even try it, okay? Whoa. Next thing you know, Biden's going to meet with Putin. Now, what does Biden say on June 16th, before they could drag him onto the plane? He says, I know, I probably shouldn't divulge this because it's inappropriate, but Putin has a real problem with the Chinese. He's being squeezed by the Chinese. They have this long border. China's not only going to be the most economic power in the world, but military power as well. The Chinese, Russians really are up against it with the Chinese problem. Well, I would love to have been a fly on the wall when Putin turned to his aides and says, who's briefing this guy on the situation 5 decades ago, okay? And long story short, Putin and Xi made it their business to tutor Biden. And that's why you end up with incredibly amicable videos and the statements that I mentioned already. Now, that's prelude here. When Putin journeyed to Beijing for the opening of the Olympics, they discussed a lot of things, and they said that. Did Putin mention to Xi that we might invade Ukraine in a little while? My notion is that he certainly did. Now, I don't think Xi said, oh, that's a great idea. I think what he said was, can you wait until the Olympics are over? And of course, 3 days after the Olympics were over, Donetsk, Lugansk were recognized as independent countries, and we had the invasion. So what does this mean? This means that Putin is filling his oats. Okay, he's got a big brother. He's got enough people that outnumber the people that vote for the U.S. and the UN right now. I mean, 1.4 billion people is a lot in China, India, Pakistan, Brazil, all these people. So what's going to happen? Well, Putin is emboldened. There's a lot of fog of war out there. A lot depends on who is winning on the ground. I don't believe CNN. I don't believe BSNBC. Do I believe the Russians? No, but I look carefully at their statements. And when they warn about a false flag attack, as apparently happened yesterday, an ammonia plant was hit, and luckily the wind was going the right way, so the village next to the ammonia plant was not poisoned. I see that coming. And I see the Russian TV and radio networks are being very, very harsh, uncommonly. I haven't seen this in decades and decades. So what we're up against here is a situation where, in my view, the Russian victory is inevitable on the ground, that their aim was never to take over the whole Ukraine. Their aim, as Putin explicitly said, was denazification, and that's a major task, and demilitarization. Now they have a cauldron. They have hundreds of thousands of troops from Ukraine, many of them the Azov battalion surrounded in southern Ukraine. That's going to be a matter of time before they clean that place out. And then a lot of those tanks will be free to go up toward Kiev. What's the solution? The solution, in my view, is a ceasefire immediately. No more fooling around with false flag attacks. That thing in the theater in Mariupol, false flag attack. Read Max Blumenthal today. He's got the final story on that. It was the Nazis that did that, okay? 300, 400 people, doesn't matter. So what we need to do is cut through the fog of war. Do I believe the defense spokesman, Major General Konashenkov, more than I believe John Kirby or Jen Psaki? Yes. Konashenkov has not lied, and he's done a lot of work speaking for the Russian military. So, you know, it's really hard to say that. And of course, I've opened myself for all kinds of accusations. But, you know, this happened with Russiagate. This happened with Iraq before the war. So I'm used to it. I'm used to being ostracized. And there's very little chance that I will be invited to any of the major media platforms, whether it's cable or TV or radio. So I could speak my mind just as I did as a CIA analyst when back in the day, we were able to speak truth to power without fear or favor. And it's a nice way to live because, you know, I don't have to work for anybody and I don't have to do anything except try to tell the truth. That's what I'm doing.
Thank you, Ray. So, Richard, what's your immediate response, or what would you like to say in reaction to what we've heard from Anatol and Ray?
Well, I think we've heard very good starting points for a multidimensional conversation. I would like to just throw out a couple of things. I was very grateful to Ray for bringing in the geopolitical level of the interaction, because I think that has taken priority over what's good for Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And it's become maybe not an actual, but a virtual proxy war between Russia and the US. And that's worth reflecting upon. And then I think it would be useful to get the reactions to who is Putin? Is he this rational calculator of what, and he made a miscalculation. Let's take that for granted, that he made a miscalculation with respect to Ukraine, but still he is an informed, normal leader and with rational objectives? Or is he this kind of geopolitical maniac that wants to recreate the old czarist empire, and person that is not mentally stable. And you find both of these images very much present in the discourse. And a third question I think would be useful to, does a peace process require a mediator? And if so, what countries or what individuals would qualify for that role? Michael Clare has written recommending Turkey, China, and what was the third country? A third country, Turkey, China, and Israel. No wonder I forgot them. They seem so implausible as a mediator. But it seems to me that's important. What is this? What will make a viable peace have some chance of becoming a durable peace?
So I guess what I heard from the two presentations was, in a sense, two very different assessments. One, Anatol, you were saying that Ukraine has won, and Ray was saying that Russia is going to absolutely win. And as I understood what you were saying, Anatol, it was more like in a Clausewitzian, at the political level, Ukraine has won. Whereas maybe Ray was more like hard military on the ground. But however we want to assess, victory or defeat, I think all of us in this gathering want the fighting to end ASAP. And I see lots of nods. That's good. I mean, if we didn't have nods on that, I would, but it might be somewhat easier to end the fighting if each side can think that it has won something of value to it. You don't want to grind everybody's noses into a defeat. We tried that with Germany after World War I. And as Tom Lehrer notably said, we taught them a lesson in 1918 and they haven't bothered us since then about Germany. So how are we going to get to a very speedy ceasefire that locks into the kind of a negotiation needed to make the cessation of hostilities final and build a sustainable peace? So I guess I'll come back to you, Anatol, first, and then everybody take it from there.
Thank you. Well, it seems to me that we may be heading for what's called a mutually hurting stalemate in Ukraine. Russia certainly will make more progress on the ground. It will capture Mariupol, in the next few days or so, and probably the whole of the Donbass areas, most of which people forget were actually held by Ukraine up until now. But I mean, on the other hand, the Russians do appear to be losing very heavy casualties. The Ukrainians have claimed several generals and other senior officers killed. The Russians have admitted some of this, and in other cases, well, they haven't produced the individuals alive, to disprove this. It's interesting that the Russians deployed far too few troops for this operation. Now, that's partly, of course, because they completely underestimated the Ukrainians, but it seems that it's also because Putin is very anxious not to use conscripts as far as possible, trying to use professionals. Of course, they're better soldiers, but it does seem also that he is worried about Russian public opinion if large numbers of conscripts end up being killed. Well, that is an argument that the Russians cannot afford to go on losing men at this rate for very long. I mean, for a while, yes, but not forever. So they have an incentive to stop and negotiate once they have, occupied what they regard as, enough, A, for their territorial claims, and B, to put pressure on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are, put up a tremendous fight, but they are also losing heavily. We hear less about that because, frankly, the Western media is very biased in favor of Ukraine. And of course, also, Russia has the will go on doing terrible damage to Ukraine if this war continues, terrible economic damage and also tremendous, physical damage and human damage to Ukraine. While I think that the Ukrainians can now hold most of their main cities, because Mariupol has 500,000 people, Kharkov has 1.5 million, Kiev has 3.5 million. These are formidable places to capture against a determined opposition. Once the Russians have dug themselves in, it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to reconquer territory from the Russians. And so you have a situation, I think, already in which, frankly, the Ukrainians are unlikely to get a better deal 5 years, 10 years down the line than they would get now. Now, of course, as Ray has suggested, there are people in Washington who have no problem with that because they don't give a damn about the Ukrainians and how many Ukrainians die. I mean, you hear people talking. I was a British journalist in Afghanistan in the 1980s. You hear people in America and Europe now talking about how, Afghanistan was such a tremendous victory, support for the Mujahideen, and the infernal, gross immorality to say that this was a cheap victory. Well, of course, it was cheap in money terms. It wasn't cheap in terms of Afghan lives, 1 million or so, and the destruction of the Afghan state, with consequences that, of course, came back to hit America terribly 10 years later. So I think that we must we must really focus on the fact that there is, I think, that there are the grounds for a peace agreement now. What would that consist of? Well, neutrality, as I've said, one, because if Ukraine will not get into NATO and NATO will not fight to defend Ukraine, then, as Zelensky has said, that's obvious. Not the dissolution of the Ukrainian armed forces, that's out of the question. But there are suggestions now from the Russian side that this could only involve, it would be folded into neutrality, and it would exclude NATO bases or certain NATO weapon systems, missiles that could threaten Russia. So something along the lines of the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you will. Denazification is still a vague one, but perhaps if Russia is anxious to reach an agreement, there could be a statement from the Ukrainian side saying, we categorically reject, Nazism and all these things. And then there are suggestions that as I myself have repeatedly advocated, the Ukrainian side should not seem to bow to Russian pressure on Russian language rights in Ukraine. It should make a free offer on its own to withdraw the laws, discriminating against the Russian language, because after all, the Russians and Russian speakers of Ukraine have deserved this, by their loyalty and resistance. Now, the biggest problem, it seems to me, is the territorial issue. Ukraine would not lose anything by recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea, because Crimea has been lost for the past 8 years. And no expert I know thinks that Ukraine can ever reconquer Crimea, even if, and no successor regime to Putin's, if such there ever is, will agree to give up Crimea again. Navalny, has said that, he said, we need a second referendum in Crimea to confirm it's part of Russia. Absolutely, fair enough. But he has certainly not said that, in fact, he's ruled it out, simply giving Crimea back to Ukraine. But the Ukrainians have suggested that this could be compartmentalized. In other words, kicked into the diplomatic long grass for future negotiations. What Russia will definitely require, however, but this, this kind of thing should be part of a peace settlement anyway, are guarantees that Ukraine won't do what Ukraine very foolishly has been doing for the past couple of years, which is blockading the water supply to Crimea, which was doing terrible damage to to Crimean agriculture and the Crimean economy. One of the reasons why Russia is demanding recognition is to rule that out in future. But obviously, a peace agreement would have to have, elements saying no military pressure, no military threats, and no economic pressure from either side, on this while the negotiating process continues. The Donbass is a bigger issue because, of course, Russia has recognized the Donbass republics in the entire territory of the two Donbass provinces, but it at the start of this war, it only held part of those provinces. That means that either the Ukrainians have to give up more territory, or the Russians have to retreat from territory that they've conquered. But there is an elegant way out of this, which is that what there could be internationally supervised referenda on the whole territory of these provinces, but on a district by district basis. And one would assume that the areas that have been separatists for the past 8 years and have been repeatedly shelled, people forget this, and bombarded by the Ukrainians would vote to stay with Russia. And I think it's a fairly safe assumption that the areas that have recently been attacked by Russia, and of course many civilians have been killed, would probably vote to stay in Ukraine. And so you would have those areas partitioned. Now, this is the kind of, in a reasonable world, all of this seems to me actually fairly obvious and negotiable. And it also seems to me the kind of thing which, in other circumstances, the West itself would put forward as its solution for a conflict of this kind. But of course, we don't live in a reasonable world, alas. You are working on this, I congratulate you, but we're not there yet, right? And secondly, of course, the West is hardly a neutral broker in this. And as Ray has said, you have powerful elements in Washington who are perfectly happy to fight to the last Ukrainian in pursuit of American geopolitical agendas of basically, well, obviously overthrowing Putin, but also weakening or destroying Russia in order to isolate China. So I think the reasonable basis for a settlement is there already. I also think, as I say, that if this war goes on for 10 years, the ultimate solution will probably look the same. But whether we can actually bring that about, God knows.
So, Ray, any response to that?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. We have a very difficult situation in Washington where Biden has very sensibly said, no fly zone, okay? And then Pelosi and Schumer invite Zelensky to say, oh, why can't we have a no-fly zone? Or why can't we have S-300s and so forth? What's wrong with that picture? Who's writing Zelensky's speeches?
I have to say that Zelensky's appearance did, for me, bring back when Netanyahu came and spoke to the Congress, undercutting the JCPOA back in 2015, 2016. I mean, there is the question of the separation of powers in this country. Who makes foreign policy? Anyway, sorry,
Well, I'll follow that with another digression, and that is when the Pope came to speak to a joint session of Congress in 2015. What did he say? He said, quote, the main problem today is the blood-soaked arms traders, period, end quote. And all those congressmen got up, and then they kind of looked in their pocket, see if the latest check from Raytheon was there, or maybe it fell out while they were clapping, or one from Lockheed. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name. Now, why do I mention that? Because that's at the root of all this thing. There are people that profiteer from this tension. profiteer from going up to almost war with Russia. And that is what I call the Mickey Mouse, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Look at all those institutions. They're all in it together. And I said media, because without the media, it doesn't work. Eisenhower himself said, look, the only antidote for the military industrial complex is a well-informed citizenry. Now, getting back to Ukraine, I don't know who's running the show. So far, Biden has resisted these folks. And then when I see Chuck Todd yesterday talking to the NATO Secretary General and saying, now look, about the no-fly zone, suppose there was a chemical attack, would that change the calculation? Would that change it, Well, that's exactly what Chuck Todd did on the 20th of August, 2012 to mousetrap Obama into setting a red line, which was violated exactly a year later in Syria when there was that chemical incident outside Ghouta, which was proven to be a false flag attack. What am I saying here? I'm saying that the fog of war is really thick on this one. Where do we get our statistics on how many people have been killed on either side? Well, we don't have any accurate statistics, and we ought to recognize that. Why can't we get to the table and just be sensible? Well, I think, and the original question there by Richard, is Putin deranged now? Or is he still a calculating kind that we thought he was? I think it's the latter, but he's got a big brother now. He's got China right behind him. And I think the implications of that have been missed by most Western analysts. So if Putin's got this big guy behind him, and he is genuinely concerned about Russian citizens in the Donbass, and he does know what's happened to them, 14,000 casualties in the Donbass. How many of those were Ukrainian nationalist guys from the Azov battalion and so forth? Very few. They were mostly Russian speakers. So I think that Putin is still very calculating, but also a little bit emotional about how he's been unable to protect these people for 8 years in the Donbass. So when he talks about denazification, there's no denying that he means that's Mariupol. That's Mariupol. They're full of the Azov battalion. So he means to conclude that. And what I'm saying here is that until he cleanses, until there's a chistka, a real cleansing of neo-Nazis, and they're easily identified. I mean, we know the people that did that terrible event in Odessa on May 2nd, 2014. We know who they are. We have their pictures. So does the KGB successor. So what I'm saying here is that we have to sort of get together and talk about what's real. And Navalny was mentioned. He's not a serious person. He has no following in Russia. He's purely a product of Western propaganda, and that can be proven. When they talk about Putin has used chemical weapons against his own people, whoa, what does that bring back? There was another guy accused of that. That was Saddam Hussein. Why are they accusing Putin of, they're thinking about Navalny, they're thinking about Skripal, they're thinking about Litvinenko? Give me a break. None of those things bear close scrutiny. And when I hear my good friends repeating them as an indication of why they, quote, detest Putin, I say to myself, wow, even the best people can be a little bit deranged when it comes to chemicals or biological, that kind of stuff. So I've said enough. Really interested in the rest of the questions that come in.
Well, I want to come back to the question Richard referred to, and that is really how, given that Anatol has told us, I think fairly convincingly, that there is a doable negotiated peace at this point, and that another 10 years of war might destroy Ukraine and completely upend a lot of the rest of the international community, but get any better deal than what you can get now. But how, just technically, what is the avenue through which such a peace can be gotten. Richard had mentioned some of the potential mediators, but how about the role of the United Nations, the OSCE, the BRICS complex, or individual governments like that of China or Turkey or Israel?
Well, I think that actually Israel might have the best chance, because Israel is more or less trusted or friendly to the three main participants, which are, let's face it, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. That cannot, alas, be said of Turkey or of China. The United Nations, I mean, look, 60 years ago under Dag Hammarskjöld, the United Nations would have been the obvious institution to step in to solve this crisis. But of course, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has basically, made it a program to subjugate the United Nations and turn it into, a powerless institution. But the United Nations can certainly help, in the form of providing international legitimacy for referenda on the status of the disputed territories, and also perhaps, and to provide genuinely neutral peacekeeping troops and observers, as in other conflicts, to monitor a ceasefire at the end of the war. Whether the present Secretary General has it in him or has the backing actually, fairly forcefully to promote a peace settlement, that I doubt. He certainly has not done so far. I do have to, however, say that I think that in our criticisms of US policy and certainly, recognition of the fact that there are neo-fascist elements in Ukraine, we should not seem, to let Putin too much off the hook here. The fact of the matter is that, he did launch this invasion. The people who he said he wanted to protect, the Russian speakers and Russians of eastern and southern Ukraine, are overwhelmingly, the civilians who are being killed in this present conflict. And also, what Putin is doing at home in terms of, repression is, and driving many people into exile, risks undoing all the cultural gains for Russia that it has made since since the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, of course, that's been an extremely ambiguous process, as we all know. It was the looting of Russia and so forth. But nonetheless, it is a terrifying sight to see just how many Russians who should be playing, a key part in their country, have been, well, first, people in senior positions excluded from Putin's inner circle over the years. And I do think that is one key reason why he was, I think, clearly very badly informed before launching this war. I mean, apart from anything else, in terms of the economic consequences, there are no senior economists or economic officials or financial officials in his inner circle, both the narrowing of the regime itself, but also, if you look at the cultural figures, including, even some like the actress Chulpan Khamatova, who were previously pro-Putin, who have now been forced into exile because they've refused to support this war. We do also need to recognize that that Putin is doing terrible damage to Russia by this. And of course, the economic damage to Russia is colossal. So, the onus is also, I mean, clearly on the Putin regime also to seek a reasonable end to this war.
So who can persuade him? Who can, I mean, the way I look at, I don't pretend to know anything about like the balance of forces in Moscow, but I mean, I sit here in Washington, DC, I see a lot of like a sort of a battle between the hawks and the relatively reasonable people here in Washington, DC. I suspect something similar is going on in Ukraine. I think Zelensky has made some very important statements, including recognizing that Ukraine will not be part of NATO. And he has continued to talk directly, or his people have continued to talk directly to the Russians, which I think is an important aspect of what's happening. So they don't necessarily need a mediator at this point, but probably mediation needs to happen, or at least support for the peace overtures, as opposed to support for militarization and all the kind of one-sidedness that goes on here in the NATO countries. How do we bring home to the publics in our countries, in the NATO countries, the massive costs of the long war? Richard, do you have any ideas on this? Because the public here in the States, and I think even more so when we were talking with Mary Kaldor in London last week, I mean, she just seemed sort of very mobilized on an anti-Putin kind of crusade. Maybe I'm characterizing her, but caricaturing what she said, but she was pretty anti-Putin.
No, you're not. You're not caricaturing.
I think what Anatol has been stressing can be translated into the domestic political discussion here, and should be. The economic repercussions so far have been felt at the gas station mainly, and that's had some impact. But to understand that this is not just a matter of isolated instances of inflation, but it risks a global food crisis. It risks imperiling interests of the US all over the world, and it would result in a sharp downturn at home, including a likely recession of a rather deep and lingering kind. So I think that responsible commentary has a role to play, even though the mainstream media has so far been rather disappointing about pointing out the negative dimensions of the way in which the US has pursued the issue. And I would fault Biden more than Ray does. He has stood up against the no-fly zone, but his speech, his State of the Union speech to Congress really was inflammatory and didn't have any dimension of seeking a durable peace or looking at the wider costs of the continuing the war. So I think we have to wonder about whether the Biden leadership is any more trustworthy in this kind of search for peace than what's going on in Moscow.
Yeah, Ray.
I'd just like to add a comment or two. The issue of who is advising Biden seems paramount. I have always said, ever since they proved themselves a year ago, that it was a junior varsity team that Biden brought in the foreign policy area. I think they've distinguished themselves as real losers. What about his economic advisors? I have no more confidence in them. And I think that they have started a ball rolling here with these sanctions and the repercussions that will be worldwide as well as in the United States, that they didn't think through, that maybe they couldn't think through because they're not that smart. And so that's a real issue that's going to be coming up. And with the midterms coming and with the general election in 2 years, it's going to play into the political situation. Now, I'm Vladimir Putin, right? And I'm looking at all this. And I'm on record as saying, United States foreign policy is hostage to domestic political developments in the United States. I've seen that, says Vladimir. I make agreements with the US president, like for a ceasefire in Syria, and the Air Force bombs the hell out of the Syrians 8 days later, even though he and I personally approved the ceasefire. So what I'm saying here is there's a real large lack of trust, and nothing's going to happen anytime soon. And what I'm interested in is stopping the carnage, okay? Let me just adduce one small personal example here. I'm a pretty old guy, right? I remember when the Russians invaded Hungary. There was a revolution in Hungary, and the Americans, we were all, oh man, they're going to throw the Russians out. No way. Russian tanks came in. What did Radio Free Europe, under our tutelage, what'd they do? Resist, lie before those Russian tanks. Make sure you fight this thing out. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people died. Now, in this case, we learned a lesson, okay? I was sent out to Munich in 1968 with the primary purpose of making sure that when the Russians invaded Prague, I and the head of our Radio Free Europe were convinced that this was inevitable, okay? When in August they did, I was able to give them guidance on what else was happening. Were they going to invade Romania? No. And please don't incite the Czechs and the Slovaks to do what we incited the Ukrainians to do. That was a very, very good job. I mean, I just felt very proud of being able to play that role. Now, what are we doing? Are we doing Hungary? Or are we doing Czechoslovakia? We're doing Hungary.
And I'd add to that, when George H.W. Bush in March of 1991 called on the people and army of Iraq to rise against the dictator there, which in the south of Iraq they did, and they got slaughtered in their tens of thousands. So, you know, let's put that into the mix too. We have some really interesting questions here. Steve Watrous is asking, who are the key people and groups in the United States on Ukraine policy? Can they be influenced?
Well, I think they can be influenced, amongst other things, by the growing threat of a global economic crisis. And also, I mean, how much they care about starvation in other parts of the world, I don't know, but they might well care about food riots and political instability in the Middle East, where key US allies, client states like Egypt, are critically dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat imports, Algeria too, Morocco. So, I mean, I think that might be a real incentive to try to bring this war to an end and lift some of the sanctions.
Yes, Ray, you have something on this.
It just, I was going to say a little thing to add, but it's not a little thing at all. It's quintessential thing. It's global warming.
Oh.
We have 10 grandchildren. Anatol has written a book about this. We have 10 grandchildren, okay? Now, everyone recognizes, even the Director of National Intelligence, that this is the real crisis we face, and that it requires cooperation among all, not only total government cooperation, but total world cooperation. And what's happening? That, as I've described it in my writings, is the mother of all opportunity costs. The mother of all opportunity costs, because the opportunity is not going to be around very many years. And to the degree this kind of strife, this kind of unnecessary killing persists, then over the long term, it will just make it quicker that my grandchildren will meet an untimely end with no fresh air and no water to drink. So, you know, this is an opportunity because it should be taken into account. That's why we need a ceasefire right away. That's why we have to kind of tuck in our pride and make sure we make a deal, because the deal, as Anatol has suggested, is ready there to be made.
Richard, I'd like to come in
And just
here.
like, if I may say, I mean, I've been horrified by the way in which climate change has disappeared. The Secretary General of the UN did actually say today that it would be madness to allow this to drive us back to dependence on fossil fuels as a short-term, response to this. But that is exactly, of course, what we see happening.
You're quite right. I want to ask Richard actually how he sees international law playing a role in bringing about a just and speedy end to the crisis, because we hear all these, calls for Putin has to go to the International Criminal Court. Putin is a war criminal. How can we deal with him? So it seems that international law, in the way that it's understood in this country right now, which is poorly, is a sort of a barrier. If you're going to threaten people with criminal prosecutions, what's the incentive for them to come to the negotiating table?
Of course, that's true. Prudentially, it seems like it works against what we all believe imperative, which is an immediate stopping of the killing, and to ratchet up this personalization of the consequences for Russia of the war seems to me to be geopolitically dysfunctional at this stage. And I would point out further that international law is, from thoughtful people, getting a very bad name, because what we're alleging about Russia is what we've done repeatedly around the world. And so one has to distinguish between international law as a normative regulator of behavior from international law as a geopolitical policy tool used against our antagonists or rivals. And it has no credibility when it's used in this latter way, and in fact diminishes the whole idea of a normative order. And when Blinken, for instance, talks about a rule-governed world, he makes it clear that the rules are governed in Washington, are generated in Washington, not in The Hague. And our response to the ICC's investigation of war crimes in Afghanistan is one thing, and it's quite another when we celebrate the investigation of Russia's war crimes. So the level of hypocrisy and the failure of the media to at least give some attention so that people can begin to understand that what we're demanding of Russia, we've never adhered to ourselves. That kind of double standard and really marginalizing not only of international law, but of the UN Charter and of the authority of the international organized society to dictate the rules or to agree upon the rules. And that's what I mean. World order is governed by the discretion of the geopolitical actors, and this was written into the Charter by giving the most dangerous countries in the world the veto power. That was part of the design of world order. International law was for the weak, not for the strong. And so that's why I distinguish between world order, that where you acknowledge that, and international law, which purports, like all law, to treat equals equally.
Good point. And of course, of the 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council, permanent members, the P5, 3 of them are members of NATO. So, you know, that is deeply baked into NATO's power in world affairs. So there was, we have a question about the mainstream media in this country from Elizabeth Axtell, who says, the mainstream media being what it is, how can Americans know what is true and not true regarding this conflict? Ray, should we come to you quickly and then go to Anatol?
Oh. Did you say me first?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, this is
how can we know what is true? I mean, it's hard.
Well, the deck is stacked against those who would like to know what the truth is. If Condoleezza Rice can go on cable TV and be asked to invading another country without real cause, is that a war crime? Yes, that's a war crime. And no one will say, my God, she's condemning herself. If one day it should be brought before the Hague for that, because that's precisely what she and her colleagues did. So what I'm saying here is that the cable TV and even some of the radio media cannot be trusted. So what do? I don't know. I've been trying for 20 years to break through. We have a pretty distinguished group of experienced professionals in intelligence, and we can't get the time of day. So I go on every show that asks me. I compliment you on this one, but it just baffles the mind that Americans can drink the stuff that they've been given to drink, the Kool-Aid, I would say, and then, you know, not realize what Condoleezza Rice represents. And more, just to finish with this here, I never heard, maybe it's my lack of education, but I never really heard wars of choice. Oh, that's a war of choice. Putin has done a war of choice against Ukraine. Well, the first time I heard about war of choice was Iraq. Okay, and that label was extremely correct with respect to Iraq, because Iraq posed no national security danger to the United States of America or Britain. Okay, now, is it different with Putin? Well, I would say that viewed from Putin's perception, viewed from his location, looking at NATO arms going into Ukraine and populating Ukraine with this kind of armament, even before Ukraine is made a member of NATO, that is a national security threat. And so it's a war of choice, but it's a difference in genus, not just species.
Okay, and Anatol, how do you get your news?
From the widest range. I mean, I suppose the BBC and the Financial Times are my basic sources, but of course I am very careful to balance them with as much information as I can from people who I trust on the ground and independent voices in the West. I certainly, I began to be disillusioned with Western media when I was a journalist myself. And certainly, I mean, what happened, over Iraq, put several nails in that coffin. So I'm not too surprised by the kind of complete loss of any attempt at objectivity, the total confusion. I mean, who said comment is free but facts are sacred? I mean, that has quite simply disappeared from CNN, MSNBC. One expected that of Fox, but as an old social democrat myself, I have been very depressed to see institutions which I used to greatly respect abandoning every standard of what I regard as respectable journalism. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. Well, all I can say is we're still better than Russia, but that is not a high bar.
Low bar, yes, low bar. So we have a question from Jeremy Breacher. Sorry if I've mispronounced your family name, Jeremy. Is there evidence that the US is pressuring Ukraine against serious negotiations? Are there ways to counteract that pressure, either in the US or internationally?
Well, I haven't seen any direct evidence of pressure. Perhaps Ray is better informed than me on this. But certainly, I mean, if you look at the statements from the Biden administration, they have, gone out of their way several times to downplay or dismiss the idea of successful negotiations. So there certainly does not appear to be any strong support for the peace process at present. And given that, inevitably, Ukraine will have to make certain concessions for peace, it is, and also that Zelensky will face serious opposition from Ukrainian hardliners. We should remember that at the start of the conflict, the commanders of the Azov battalion called Zelensky a traitor for even agreeing to talk to the Russians and suggesting neutrality. Now, they've gone quiet on that because Zelensky, of course, has emerged as a great national hero, in the course of the war. But we should not remember that the number of leaders, even great national heroes, who have been murdered when they have, tried to make peace. So Zelensky is going to need, the fullest possible backing of the West when it comes to making a peace deal, and I don't see that at present.
I agree with Anatol on that. I think that Biden has it within his power to tell the Pelosi's and the Schumers and the high-level military commentators on Fox and BSNBC and the rest of them to knock it off and to say, look, we're going to stop the carnage right now. And I'm going to tell Zelensky to be serious about the negotiations, and I'm going to give him his head in working out a deal. Now, that might not work, but that would be a different situation than exists now. Right now, we're just happy to sell more arms. I mean, the arms that destroyed, all those arms that's destroyed by Soviet missile attacks, the Mickey Mouse is clapping its hands because they will have to be replaced. In other words, the Pope was right. It's the blood-stained arm traders that are behind this. And of course, they control the media. That's big. That's what Eisenhower warned us against.
So I'm going to throw a curveball in. I know curveball is a bad term in the context of a build up to war, but here's one for you. Do you think maybe people in China in decision-making areas are just happy to see Russia and NATO duking it out over there at the western end of the Eurasian landmass?
Yes, I think so.
I'm not sure, actually. They don't seem to be terribly happy, partly because, of course, of the effects on the world economy and on energy prices, which have a direct effect on the Chinese economy. I mean, clearly, there is a certain satisfaction, but and obviously very deep feeling against NATO and the US, but also it seems to me, I mean, the Chinese have been very, very cautious so far about actually helping Russia economically. And I mean, that's the key, that will be the key issue. I mean, are they prepared to prop up the Russian economy in order to keep Russia fighting in Ukraine? Well, propping up the Russian economy will be a pretty formidable, task, even for China. So I wonder whether, the Chinese, the Chinese have been built up into this great sort of huge, reckless bogeyman. But actually, it seems to me that, with the sole exception of the South China Sea, the Chinese have behaved with tremendous caution, actually, in recent years in most parts of the world. So, well.
Well, the Chinese have already lifted all restrictions on the import of wheat and soybeans from Ukraine, from Russia. In other words, they can, there's defeating the sanctions that way. They've also done other things that suggest that the US dollar has seen its best days. And, this may not be seen as explicit cooperation to save Russia, but it is the alternative universe now. We have a bipolar world once again, but this time it's NATO and the US against China and Russia. And that old triangular thing, well, it's an isosceles triangle now with the US at the short end. And it's high time that Putin's advisors got onto that and told them that there are real limits as to how you can affect the world economically and other ways. There's really, as I said,
hang on, do you mean Biden's advisors or Putin's advisors? You said Putin.
I'm sorry?
You said Putin's advisors, but did you mean Biden's advisors?
I'm sorry, I meant Biden's. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah. Again, I've said before that Biden's advisors do not inspire confidence, not only in the foreign policy realm, but who is in China, especially, but who is advising him on economic affairs. What he has unleashed is a god-awful chaos in the whole world that's going to affect everybody. And did they realize that? Well, the Russians and China, as I see it, are in this together. And to the degree that the military stuff happens against NATO, I could see the Chinese saying, well, at least we don't have to worry about the South China Sea of Taiwan for the next couple of years, probably. And that's got to be a good thing for Xi Jinping.
I'm afraid our time is kind of coming to a close, but I know Richard wants to speak, and then maybe we'll ask both the guests if they have a couple of final words. So Richard, yes.
Yeah, well, first let me say that it's been a very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion that I think has illuminated several of the key facets of this very complicated situation in the Ukraine. I would just add to the discussion of the place of China that even before Ukraine, China's geopolitics was predominantly economistic outside its own region. And that would lead me to think that it isn't taking much comfort from the continuation of the Ukraine war or its broader ramifications. So I think China is the most responsible geopolitical actor we have in the world at this stage. And part of the regressive features of Biden's foreign policy was this geopolitically confrontational approach taken to China almost immediately when he arrived at the White House.
That's a really important point, Richard. Thank you so much. I just want to come back and give, certainly thank both of our guests really for wonderful engagement, wonderful presentations, and so much more for us to all think about. Anatol Lieven, would you like to give us 2 sentences to take away?
Well, just that, as I say, I think that a reasonable peace settlement is becoming possible now, and that I really hope it can be reached, because I think the basic terms will be the same months or years down the line, and the only difference will be that tens or hundreds of thousands of people have died. And so I would urge everybody to do their utmost, whatever we can do, to try to help bring about an early peace settlement, and try to make sure that the United States and other democracies actually, support a peace settlement instead of covertly undermining one.
Important point. Thank you so much. And Ray McGovern, 2 sentences, not more.
The only thing that hasn't been mentioned is nuclear. We learned recently, or I learned recently, that the Russian early warning system is deficient and that Putin would have only 8 minutes to decide whether he's under nuclear attack. Those are the realities. That is a situation that has to be fixed. I think we can figure out ways to fix it, but I'm already over my 2 sentence. I would suggest that Richard and you, Helena, be the intermediaries to be the moderators of the Ukraine, China, Russia thing. I think you should insert yourself now before it's too late. And I very much thank you for inviting me.
No, it's been great to have both of you. And I would just note that Monday of next week, we're going to have 2 experts on nuclear deterrence and the fragile psychology of nuclear deterrence, Cynthia Lazaroff and David Barash. We should probably have had people talk about the nuclear dimension of this at the beginning of the series, because, you know, we've now had 30 years of Americans growing up without really having to understand nuclear deterrence and mutual deterrence, which is what we're now seeing. You know, nuclear has to be in the discussion. So thanks for that reminder, Ray. We have such a lot more to talk about. People attending this webinar can find details of the whole of the upcoming schedule. Well, we have 2 more sessions, one on Wednesday and one next Monday. Go to our website, www.justworldeducational.org, and learn about the upcoming guests. When you go to the website, please don't forget the donate button. This whole Just World Educational is run on grassroots support. Right now, we're kind of going ahead on fumes. So as I've said earlier, we need more fumes here. Please donate. As you exit the webinar, you'll find an exit poll. It would be great if you could fill it out, because it really helps us plan our programming. And the next webinar in this series on Wednesday, March 23rd at 2:30 p.m. Eastern will feature Phyllis Bennis of the Institute of Policy Studies, and with us from Sri Lanka, the writer and analyst Indi Samarajiva, who will give us once again a view from the global south on this conflict. So thank you very much, Ray McGovern, Anatol Lieven, and Richard. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Look forward to it.
Thank you so much. It was extremely interesting.
Thanks very much.